So on behalf of the Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, we want to welcome you to today's webinar, which is Provider Wellbeing, Supporting Staff Resilience and Recovery During Hard Times. We're really excited to have Ken Crable from C4 Innovations with us today to talk about this important topic. And we're very grateful to have so many of you to join us to learn about this important topic. And we look forward to sharing some information and tips and guidance and having an exchange of information with all of you. My name is Lydia Chwastiak. I'm a psychiatrist at the University of Washington and one of the co-directors of the Northwest MHTTC. So I want to just take a minute to talk about the MHTTC and the network. Next slide, please. The MHTTC network is a national network of training and TA centers that's supported by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And our purpose is to support the mental health workforce to disseminate and implement evidence-based practices. And some of our other goals include heightening the awareness, knowledge, and skills of the workforce, fostering regional and national alliances related to mental health, and also providing free training and technical assistance like this training today. A couple of words about our Northwest MHTTC on the next slide. That we are, our Northwest MHTTC is based in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the University of Washington. We provide training and technical assistance to Region 10, which is Alaska, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. And our area of focus for the national network relates to evidence-based practices for serious mental health issues, in particular psychosis. But we also provide training on a variety of topics, including integrated care, suicide prevention, diversity and equity issues, school mental health, peer support, and trauma-informed approaches, and many other topics. So our target workforce is behavioral health and primary care providers and staff, school and social service staff, and others whose work has the potential to improve behavioral health outcomes for individuals with or at risk for developing serious mental illness. We fulfill our mission through live events like this webinar that we also record and post, virtual training and learning communities, free self-paced online courses, newsletters, and our resource library that's all on our website, and connection to other training centers and events. So to find out more about our center and our goals, the training opportunities, resources, you can visit our website and sign up for our newsletter. Just a few words about language on the next slide, please. That we really want to always be mindful to use language that promotes recovery and culturally appropriate terminology. We encourage all clinicians to use language that demonstrates respect for people's dignity and worth. And this is consistent with recovery-oriented practices and promotes treatment environments that foster respect, human dignity, and hope. So just a couple of housekeeping details before we get started and I turn it over to Ken. The next slide. We've made every attempt we can to make sure that today's presentation is secure. If we do need to end the presentation unexpectedly, we will follow up with you using your registration information. We have a very large audience today, so all attendees will be muted and will not appear on video. And the chat will be open though and will be available for you to use. The presentation is being recorded. Recording of the slides will be made available to you on our website, and we'll notify you by email when the recording is available. It'll probably be in a few weeks. We ask that if you share a question or a scenario during today's presentation and it's about a clinical situation, to please be mindful to avoid disclosing identifying details about any person receiving services. And also a reminder that we will have certificates of attendance available to people if you desire that. Those will be available within 2 weeks, but we will not have formal CEUs available. Quick word, one thing that you can do for us on the next slide is that SAMHSA requires us to evaluate our training activities. We offer free, all of our trainings and resources are free, and the only catch is that we have a very quick evaluation at the end. Your feedback is really crucial to our work, so we'd appreciate your response to a very short survey. It just takes a few minutes. And at the end of the session, one of our staff will put the link into the chat. So we really appreciate this because this really helps us continue our work in providing free training activities. 2 comments about questions and chat on the next slide. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions today. There's a Q&A box at the bottom. This is for you to chat in, to type in your questions in the Q&A box at any point during the presentation. Ken will try to get to as many questions as possible by the end of the presentation, and we may have some time at the end to answer a question or two. Please don't put your questions for Ken in the chat box though, because he won't be able to see them and we won't be able to respond to them. So we'll ask you to move them over to the Q&A box. So content questions for Ken go into the Q&A box. And we'll try to keep track of this, and we'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible. The chat is on the next slide, will be a place that if you're having technology issues or questions about logistics, our MHTTC staff will see those and will respond and try to help you out. One final word before I turn it over to Ken is just an acknowledgement on the next slide that we're grateful to our funder. The MHTTC is supported through a cooperative agreement with SAMHSA. And just a disclaimer that the presentation is Ken's and not official position of SAMHSA. Okay, so now we're ready to turn it over to Ken. We're really excited to have Ken present for us today. He's a social worker by training and a senior trainer. He's worked in behavioral health care and housing services for more than 35 years and has 18 years of experience working as a behavioral health practitioner in services for people who are living homeless. Over the past 2 decades, he's been developing curricula and facilitating in-person and online training nationally on topics including motivational interviewing, trauma-informed care, outreach and engagement, case management, critical time intervention, and supervision. So I will now turn it over to Ken.
Thank you so much, Lydia, and welcome everyone. I'm delighted to be with you. I trust that you can hear me and see me, even better that you can see the slides. So we will launch. I should say something about the title, that I decided to call it Supporting Staff Resilience and Recovery During Hard Times, but I think we could have called it Extraordinary Times or Turbulent Times or Maddening Times or Scary Times, confusing, challenging, whatever word you wish to use. But I also think we could call it Supporting Staff Resilience During Hopeful Times and times of discovering and rediscovering and unlearning perhaps, and relearning and strengthening. So it's kind of a both and, but I think the overwhelming kind of experience that many of us have been having over the past at least a year now and more has been definitely very challenging and difficult. So I welcome you. I would love to meet each of you individually, but that's not going to happen. I would say if you wish to just type your name into the chat box and maybe your particular role in your organization, as well as your geographic location, I welcome that. Chances are we won't be able to see all of them, but please make yourself known if you wish to. I'm directing this towards people who are leaders in agencies, and that can mean people in lots of different positions, whether or not you have a title or not that suggests that you're a leader, but particularly for directors, supervisors, team leaders, people who are maybe have a fair amount of experience and come with that both lived experience and work experience. So in whatever way you want to define leader, this is for you today. And these are some of the learning objectives that I've created. Hopefully that these will be met and more than that. I do want to say this, that I do have material to present today, but I come to you as a co-expert. Each of you already has tremendous amount of expertise. Each of you already knows very well what you're doing. You know how to support staff. You've been doing it. You've been making adaptations. You've been continuing to make adaptations. So I'm certainly not here suggesting that I have lots of new and exciting information that you've never heard before. What I hope for, however, is that what I do have to share is one, confirmatory of what you're already doing, and that there might be some bits and pieces that add to that and give you some new seed of something to think about and consider. And I want to say too that yes, I'm here and I'm being asked to provide training, but each of us in this room is a trainer in our own right. And so I would be delighted if you would share not only your questions, but also your comments, your insights along the way. And there will be times when I'll be inviting that. I'm going to start with a piece that I wrote over time about 30 years ago, actually. I am from the Northwest. I live in Seattle. I worked at Downtown Emergency Service Center that many of you know for many years, much of that with the Harborview's Healthcare for the Homeless project, but did case management and direct service for people experiencing homelessness. And in the midst of that experience, which was for me a hard time, it was also a time that I just found to be an experience that was none that I would ever want to not have had. But it was an experience that I had to grapple with a lot of things. And so I wrote this piece well before COVID and well before 2020, if you will. And I'll share it with you here. But my way of conceptualizing the work was that it was both exhilarating and exhausting. It drove me up a wall and it opens doors that I never imagined. It lays bare a wide range of emotions and yet leaves me feeling numb beyond belief. This work provides tremendous satisfaction and leaves me feeling profoundly helpless. It evokes genuine empathy and provokes a fearsome intolerance within me. It puts me in touch with deep suffering and at the same time points me towards greater wholeness. This work brings me face to face with many poverties and enriches me encounter by encounter. It renews my hope and leaves me grasping for faith. It enables me to envision a future, but with no ability to control that future. It breaks me apart emotionally, and it breaks me open spiritually. It leaves me wounded, and it heals me. This is one way of trying to capture the both and nature of this work. And I don't know each of your work settings, but knowing that you work in mental health, behavioral health, and in settings that are working with people who, many of whom have been marginalized, I suspect that this is somewhat akin to your experience as well. And so for that, I offer it to you. But what has happened in the last year has just sort of compounded all of this in many ways. And so I use this image, which is a little over the top, but this is the image that I came up with that just sort of portrays the crazy chaos that's been going on and the kind of the violence even and the kind of unfettered kind of out of controlness that seems to be rampant in many ways. And it's interesting that the word apocalypse, however, is also a word that means an unveiling or an uncovering or revealing. And so it's not just about the violence and the chaos, it's actually showing what's underneath all that. And for this, we might say the systemic inequities, the systemic racism, the systemic classism, the systemic homophobia and sexism and all of these things, and the power and the money and the greed, all of that stuff, right, that we all know about. But also what's being unveiled in this is this sense that there are a lot of good people and good things happening in the world. And for an image, I came up with a mirror because I'm suggesting that you can look in this mirror and see yourself because you are part of that wonderful movement that's taking place that is seeking to show compassion for people and seeking to promote healing and seeking to bring about the best in people while living with serious mental illness, while living with addiction, while living with whatever conditions they have. So I guess I just want to, this is my way of just trying to describe the times in which we live and recognize that while it feels pretty negative, if you're reading the news a lot of the times, there's a whole undercurrent of pretty amazing things that have been going on and continue to go on. But it is traumatic. There's no doubt about that. And many of you are very familiar with trauma and trauma-informed care and the terms. But we know that the hallmark characteristic of trauma of any kind is it has an overwhelmingness to it. It demands on our physiology as well as our mental state and our emotional state and our communal state, this profound sense of being out of control and at loss of a sense of direction and a feeling of being unsafe. Another definition that pops up is similar to that it's this idea of traumatic events that overwhelm our ordinary systems of care, as Judith Lewis Herman says. Peter Levine says that in short, trauma, and here I'm referring to the trauma of our times, is about loss of connection. Loss of connection to ourselves, to our bodies, our families, our loved ones, to the world around us. And it happens over time. And I've been reflecting on this recently, and it's, again, I don't know your experience, but for myself, COVID and the political turmoil and the uprising happening for racial equity and the anti-racism things going on, they're not all traumatic, they're also hopeful, but but in the midst of all of this going on, that there has been this sort of tendency to both feel disconnected as well as to reconnect with some of the values that that we want to promote. So it's really an interesting time, as I'm sure you can all attest. We all know the human stress response to trauma, and I'll just say for myself that I know that for the last year in particular, especially in relation to COVID, that I have not been sleeping as well. I know that my heart rate's a little faster. I know that my stomach hasn't been operating at full capacity. My muscles have become tense. And I generally regard myself as a pretty calm and collected person, but I've certainly noticed this in my body, and I bet you have too. And so one of the things I just want to say is in the midst of everything going on and then trying to support staff, it's very, very normal that we ourselves are going to feel a little revved up. We're going to feel the physiological response to the cortisol and other stress hormones coursing through our bodies. And that this is okay. It's actually our bodies taking care of ourselves and our brains protecting us. But we do end up responding in various ways to this. And my experience is that there's a little fight in all of us for this, but oftentimes what really takes hold is a sense of just shutting down or freezing or feeling closed off or feeling disconnected and then depressed and overwhelmed. And this is some imagery that sort of comes to my mind of what our experience has been. So I'm just going to invite you for the moment in the chat box to just name, say, one or two words or phrases that encompass what your overarching sense of feeling has been, either individually or in a collective sense, what you feel it's been. And I'm just curious of what the words are that come out. So just put your fingers to the keyboard if you would, and would love to see what you've got to say. So overwhelmed, lonely, yeah, hopelessness, anxiety, yep, disconnect. Yeah, exhausted, yeah, tired, a kind of a profound tiredness, a numbness, a fear, and certainly, yeah, all of these things. And so the good news, I guess, is we're not alone in this. We're connected in that, but we are actually feeling these things that have a new term I learned lately, allostatic load, right? This sort of overwhelming stress that just affects us in everything we are and do. I share this quote because all of you as leaders, I'm sure, are very busy and have plenty to do and more than enough to do. And it should be that way. But I also want to point out that in the midst of all that, if feeling the need to be busy all the time is part of your experience, it can be in and of itself a trauma response, a distraction based on fear that keeps us from really calming, quieting ourselves and noticing what's really going on when we slow down. And this is certainly true for myself. I'm tempted in this direction, but I'm also trying to, in my own life, try to find those spaces where I can slow down, be quiet, and learn from the experience I'm having, and try to understand what the teaching moment is, if you will. So just a thought in case that resonates with you. Archbishop Desmond Tutu was asked at one point, "What do you do in times of despair?" And he said, "You show your humanity." Um, and then I came across this, which I really like. You know, we don't get to choose whether we're human, but we certainly choose whether we continue to be human and act with compassion, act with goodness towards others, and keep our selfishness at bay, if you will. So, a word about leadership in hard times. Again, I'm thinking of each of you on here as a person in a leadership role in some form or another, and you've learned by now that I like quotes, and I'll continue to share a few. But when I think about leadership in hard times, I do think about the necessity to step forward and create safe space for people, create a sense of direction, a sense of predictability to the extent possible in unpredictable times. And I've come to believe that leadership, based on this quote, is truly the sum of hundreds of thousands of small words and tiny actions. It's not a thing, it's all of these things, if you will. And in fact, I think leadership is probably shows its face for the most part in the much more subtle ways that we put ourselves forward, and indirect ways than like in our attitudes and in our way of being with people, more so than the words we say even. Rosabeth Moss Cantor says leaders are more powerful role models when they learn than when they teach. Interesting thought. And above all, leadership is a position of servanthood. So I don't know how that sits with you. I suspect, though, that in the work that you do, you have learned that leadership is really something that is an art. It's a skill. It's a mindset. It's a heart set. It's all of those things. But people are very appreciative when they're in the presence of good leadership, in which they feel like they're not being bowled over, they're not being overly directed, they're micromanaged, but they're being trusted to do their work. And so I hope that these are characteristics of your own leadership in these days and times. And ultimately, it's about our actions and our examples that we put forward that make the most difference. So out of curiosity, I'm just wondering if you might list in the chat box, just what, in as succinct a form as possible, what are some of the challenges that you personally are facing in the context of supporting staff in these times? What's hard for you? What's making it difficult for you to be the leader you want to be, if you will? And we'll just take a moment to identify some of that. And I'd be happy to share some ideas. I think for me, staying focused is one of those. But I'm seeing, way too much crisis, right? The virtual world that we live in is in itself disconnecting and distancing. Yeah, a lot of isolation. Yeah, and then staff shortages. People either not being hired in the first place, or having to go on sick leave, or all manner of things happening, or being laid off. Yeah, thank you. Again, you can all read these, but and I know that for myself that it's sort of like I get caught up in the news cycle. I get caught up in the work cycle, and and I forget to breathe. I forget to be myself. I forget to laugh. I forget to have fun. And so, and then, yeah, again, burnout, inconsistent directions, balancing real urgency with the need for self-care. Absolutely. So again, for the sake of time, I'll keep going, but thank you for responding in that way. So it turns out that when we are leading and supporting others, that the starting point has to be with ourselves. And Pema Chodron is a Buddhist nun who wrote a piece from a piece entitled Compassionate Action. And I'm going to read it to you here because she says, leading others, helping others, it all starts with loving kindness for oneself. So I'm going to hone in on that here a little bit because truly leadership means that we have to have our feet planted on the ground. We have to be centered as much as possible. We have to be grounded. We have to be bringing our best selves forward for these times and for this work. She writes, how do we help? How do we create a saner world or a saner domestic situation or job situation wherever we may be? How do we work with our actions and our speech and our minds in a way that opens up the space rather than closes it down? In other words, how do we create space for other people and ourselves to connect with each of our own wisdom? How do we create a space where we can find out how to become more a part of this world we are living in and less separate, less isolated, and less afraid? How do we do that? It all starts with loving kindness for oneself, which in turn becomes loving kindness for others. As the barriers come down around our own hearts, we are less afraid of other people. We are more able to hear what is being said, see what is in front of our eyes, and work in accord with what happens rather than struggle against it. When you can put yourself in someone else's shoes, then you know what is needed and what would speak to the heart. So I want to say a few more words about self-care, or shall we call it self-preservation. Parker Palmer, a Quaker educator, says, it's never a selfish act. It's really just being a good steward of this gift that we've been given, this body, mind, and spirit. And anytime we can listen to our true self and give the care it requires, then we can use that for the purpose of touching other people's lives and helping them become enriched and to grow and to thrive. And so I really like this notion that, we think of self-care sometimes as doing it for ourselves, and there's a truth in that, but we're really doing it for everyone whose lives we touch as well. Audre Lorde also is another person who talked about self-care as not being self-indulgent, but it's self-preservation. It's maintaining, staying alive. And in addition to that, it's also an act of political warfare. Now, I can't say for sure what she would have said more to describe that, but what I hear in that is if we are going to affect change at systemic levels, which is so needed these days in so many ways, certainly in the mental health system, right? But also in our court system, in our political system, in welfare system, and economics, that we need to be well enough to be able to fight those political fights and be able to stand up for what is right and what is just. And so I really love this notion of expanding self-care beyond the notion of sitting on the top of a mountain in a hermitage, which I'm all for, but I think sometimes it seems to be an end unto itself, and when in fact it's a means, I think, to becoming a more compassionate person. And I don't know if we can show empathy for other people if we can't first show empathy for ourselves. I think that's a really challenging thing to do. Now, there are things that nobody tells you about self-care, and I'm going to share that with you here. Being a social worker myself, I relate to this, but here's the stuff that we don't talk about when we talk about self-care. But it includes a lot of adulting. It means that we ought to be doing activities that we really want to put off indefinitely. Sometimes it means making tough decisions, which we fear others will judge. I certainly have been in the space, I bet you have too, where you knew the best thing you needed to do in the moment was to take some time alone or get some rest or just do something that was attentive to your own needs. And yet you were tempted and maybe yielded to the temptation to do something just to conform, just to be with the group and not to appear like you're separating yourself or whatever else might come up. Self-care also involves asking for help. The irony is that you can't care for yourself by yourself. And it requires us to be honest with ourselves, to be vulnerable, and then to talk with loved ones about what it is that we ourselves need and to ask them to support us in doing that. One way to think about this as it's a way of living intentionally by which we are putting forward our values, our attitudes, our actions, and having them be integrated into our day-to-day routines. It's interesting to me that the word living with integrity, in many ways, it seems, is really about living in a way that our values and actions and what's important to us is truly integrated with what we actually do and say. That to me is living a life of integrity, or at least one way to think about that. So I'm pausing for a moment and just looking at a few things in the chat box, and I'm appreciating some of these questions. How can we give to others if we are running on empty? Absolutely, absolutely. What else am I seeing here? A few technical questions. So, but yeah, the term compassion fatigue comes up here, and burnout, and secondary trauma, and tertiary trauma, and vicarious trauma. All of these terms are things that are real, they impact us, we're affected by it, and we need to be able to find a way to take that and hold it at somewhat of a distance and continue to return to our own self-care, I do believe. So for those of you who need something to be made painfully obvious, it really does boil down to eating healthfully and regularly, moving our bodies regularly, getting our heart rates up, drinking lots of water in addition to anything else that we might drink, getting ample sleep, loving ourselves, and continuing to do this over and over again. I know it sounds simple, and when I say it, it sounds simple, but putting it into practice ultimately is what's difficult, but so necessary, especially in these times. And I think eating and sleeping, especially, and moving daily are so critical to these times when we're often stuck in front of a screen, and it's easy to get stuck there for a long time. A word about mindfulness, being here now. I think that mindfulness, of course, is a term that's used in a lot of ways in a general way. But what I'd like to suggest is that we can't really practice self-care unless we begin with cultivating an awareness of what it is that our bodies are saying to us, what we're needing. And so it really is taking time to focus on the quality of awareness that is in each moment. Jon Kabat-Zinn says it's about paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, without making a judgment about it. And Thich Nhat Hanh says, mindfulness shows us what's happening in our bodies, our emotions, our minds, and also in the world. So it's really this sense of awareness. And when we practice this kind of level of awareness, we are much more likely to avoid harming others as well as ourselves. What we're not talking about are these things, as nice as it would be sometimes. And there are certainly elements of truth in mindfulness that incorporate these things, but really mindfulness is just kind of a very mundane, non-exciting kind of practice of just living with that awareness. But it's always interesting to me how much I tend to live in the past or in the future, or try to, when in fact the present right in front of me is so interesting. And it's being mindful of our breath, it's being mindful of how our body's feeling, what's around us by just looking around us and taking that in. So I'm going to invite you into a brief exercise, about 2 minutes, in which I'm going to just say a series of statements and leave about 4 or 5 seconds in between each one. And just invite you to take some time to try this on for size. And this is coming from dialectical behavioral therapy skills training by Marsha Linehan, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. I've adapted it a bit, but if you would, and if you want, you don't have to do this, but please find a comfortable position. And then staying in that position, I'm going to invite you to listen to how your response, or what your response is after each statement, how your body responds, how your mind responds, how your spirit responds. And then, like I said, there will be about 5 seconds between each. Okay, here we go. Feel your hair touching your head. Feel your belly rising and falling as you breathe. Feel the space between your eyes. Feel the distance between your ears. Feel your breath touching the back of your eyes while you inhale. Notice your arms touching your body. Feel the bottoms of your feet. Imagine a beautiful day at the beach. Notice the position of your tongue in your mouth. Feel how one arm is more relaxed than the other. Notice any tightness in your left thigh. Imagine what it would feel like to float on a cloud. Imagine what it would feel like to be stuck in molasses. Imagine floating in warm water. Imagine a beautiful flower. Feel your face getting soft. As we close, I'll invite you to simply notice your breathing. Notice how your body breathes for you. You don't have to think about it, but we can be mindful of those breaths. And then I'll invite you to come back into our webinar. If any of you want to make a brief comment or state a phrase of what that experience was like for you, I welcome that. You don't have to. For some people, it's kind of strange and weird. Others, it's very relaxing. Others, it's kind of unique and whatever. So, all right. So we'll move forward here. And I'm going to do another exercise with you. We're going to do it pretty quickly, just given the nature of how time is fleeting. But this is something I call a river of resilience exercise. I've borrowed it and adapted it from other sources. But what I'm going to do is, if we were face to face in a room, I would hand out a piece of paper with a river or with some instructions on it that would look like this. but instead we're going to do it this way. So I'm going to invite you to respond to each of the questions I put up here, and or statements, and in a word or a phrase, just invite you to put it in the chat box as soon as it comes to mind. So don't overthink it. But again, what I'm attempting to do here is provide you with an activity for yourself, but also maybe one you could use with staff as a way of helping us remember who we are, what's important to us, what inspires us, and that kind of thing. So the first question I'll ask is, what are your core values? And you can state one or two, it's up to you, but at least a core value that's really, really important to you. And maybe you've noticed, especially during these times, you keep coming back to. It's like a good solid anchor for you. Go ahead and type, but what are some values, if you would, that are important to you during these times? Yeah, beautiful. Connection, honesty, compassion, integrity, faithfulness. Yeah. Yeah, family, ethics, motivated by love, all of these things. Thank you for that. Let's go with another. What are your strengths, or what's a particular strength that you are drawing upon, particularly during these days? And this isn't bragging. This is just saying, this is something that I am reasonably good at. I'm not perfect at, but I find that it gives me strength and I draw upon it. So what is it that is a strength that you are exercising these days? And it may be very closely related to some of your values. But yeah, life experience and faith for sure. Laughter, humor, a lightness of being, a sense of positive thinking and positivity, being determined and going for it, right? And being organized and having quiet time and creativity, absolutely. So again, we'll just move on to another. Who is a person who is significant to you, who inspires you? And again, I'm going to contextualize that in these days and times. However, it might not be somebody you've ever met. It might be somebody you actually live with, or it could be somebody who lived hundreds of years ago, for that matter. But who is a person? And you don't have to name them by name. You can name them by a relationship, or if you want to put a name out there, I invite you to do that as well. But just out of curiosity, MLK Jr. for sure. Yeah. Your boss, kids, brothers, children, Brene Brown for sure, the Dalai Lama. Yeah. I'm glad to see some bosses showing up here because you are, for many people, many of you are supervisors and bosses, and hopefully you are a tributary into the stream of people's life in a way that they draw upon the strength that you have provided for them and the inspiration. Mom, parents, yeah, staff for sure. Good, good, good. All right, two more. This is one that I'm going to request that be careful in what you choose to share. But many of us have faced many challenges in life, and they've also been the source of strengthening for us, even what we might call post-traumatic growth. That we have come from those experiences being much richer for the experience we've had, even though we wouldn't necessarily wish it on ourselves or anyone. What might this be for you? And again, you self-disclose as you wish, but certainly for many people, all forms of loss, death, loss of relationships, having the experience of depression and alcoholic family members, living with bipolar, with cancer, or having had cancer, addictions, relationships ending, but things that we can again say, okay, I'm not grateful for this, but I'm grateful for the lessons learned, if you will, and for the way it's made me a better person. Working remotely, abuse, living in an abusive relationship and what that was like. Yeah, having walked alongside people who are suffering, for sure. Getting fired. Yeah. Yeah. And again, it, one of the things that I love about this is that we can recognize that even though we have so-called bad experiences, it is possible to recognize that there's a both and quality to these two, that they can lead us to be more real and be more in touch and be more empathic potentially, and be people who have more depth to our character. That certainly has been my experience with people with lived experience, including my own. So if we wanted to call out a purpose or calling, we could do that too. I'm going to go ahead and, well, let's go ahead and do that one yet too. What would you say in a sentence or a word or a phrase is right now kind of your sense of call, your sense of purpose in life, if you choose to share that? Yeah, certainly serving, advocating, guiding, easing the suffering, lessening stress. Yeah, being an anchor. Yeah, I love the metaphors, and helping people who have been marginalized by our systems and by individuals, and working for equity and justice. Yeah, beautiful. Again, I trust that for you, this is a helpful reminder personally of what it is you already have inside you and what you bring to this experience and what you're drawing upon. And I would just say that if we can do something similar with people that we supervise or oversee uh, in our leadership roles, I think there's some value in being reminded and reminding ourselves and then sharing those with one another. So be that what it is, we'll move on from there. Thank you so much for your responses. Just a few notes on what staff need. And I'm drawing this from this book, First Break All the Rules. And this comes from the Gallup organization, the people who do all those polls. And they did this massive set of interviews. This comes actually from the early 2000s. And they kind of distilled down after talking with people from all kinds of corporations and small businesses and nonprofits and mental health centers and all manner of places where people congregate. And they tried to distill down the essence of what it is that people are looking for and needing in their workplace. And so I'm sharing this because I think this becomes even more evident during stressful and hard times. And I'll go through these fairly quickly, but we're talking here about one of the key questions is what do I get? And that means, do I know what's expected of me at work? And I think prior to the pandemic, when we lived life differently and worked differently, it may be that things were a lot clearer. But now with shifting to working remotely for many of you and all of the other kinds of changes that have been made, do staff still know what's expected of them? And do they have the materials and equipment they need to do that work, right? I imagine many of you have been involved in purchasing supplies for people that they need. Another question that people ask is, what do I get to give? Do I have the opportunity to do what I do best every day? So I want to just say a word about this, is that it doesn't mean, and I do know that during pandemic, for example, that people's job responsibilities have had to change. They're not able to do some things. They're being called into doing other things perhaps, or in different ways. But there is something about job satisfaction that takes into account that we want to provide as much as possible the kinds of tasks, the kinds of responsibilities that people feel like they're best at, that they have an aptitude for, a knowledge, a skill set for. So it might not be everything they do, but certainly the bulk of what people are doing are, as leaders, we want to ensure that people are being asked to do the things that they're good at so that they're not feeling like they're struggling. In the last week, have I received recognition or praise for doing good work, or affirming words about just appreciation, not for the outcome so much as, but for the effort that's taking place? And again, in these days and times, we don't observe maybe as readily the work that people are doing, but we can certainly learn in different ways and listen in perhaps But nonetheless, we need to be affirming the things, the good stuff about people, right? That goes a long way for helping people stay motivated and energized during these times. Does my supervisor or someone at work seem to care about me as a person, as a human being, not as a employee who's just plugging a need? And I trust that all of you who are in supervisory roles and leadership roles are in fact appreciating the humanity of people you're working with. But this is a critical need, according to the research, that we're seen as people who are human with human needs. And this might mean learning about people and their lives to the extent they want to share beyond just, are you doing your work and getting it done? Does someone encourage your development? And I think during these times, there actually are ample opportunities for new development, for learning new skills, for branching out, for maybe doing things in a different way. And so are we encouraging that, helping people continue to grow rather than this sense that we need to be sort of fixed in place and just slogging our way along, which it does feel like sometimes. But can we look at those places where people can learn new skills, learn new knowledge, maybe get more training in areas? And then there are questions like, do I belong here? Do my opinions count? Does the mission of the company make me feel my job is important? And again, I think this is always a challenge, right? Even in the best of times. But are we going out of our way as leaders to ensure that we're hearing and asking good questions to learn about and get good ideas and invite people to share all kind of expertise that they have and to brainstorm with us? And then lastly, we have this sense of, can we all grow together? Are we all in this together? I think there's nothing more demoralizing when people feel like they're pulling more weight than others are. And I know this is a challenge in these times, particularly when people are getting ill. But again, this is something to be aware of. And do I have a best friend? And this one really leapt out at me when I first read it. It's like, huh? Do I have a best friend at work? It's not saying, is my very best friend a coworker? It's saying, do I have somebody at work that I can turn to and just feel perfectly safe and comfortable to just hang out and be myself? And I'm not here saying to gossip with. I don't think that's helpful, but be with somebody where you feel perfectly comfortable and you can let your guard down a bit if necessary. Is someone talking to you about your progress, both now, but also as time continues? And then in the last year, have you had opportunities to work to learn and grow? So I do recognize that each of these needs that staff has is going to be different in how it manifests itself in your work settings. And it's going to be difficult for some of them to actually be given attention to in these times. But these are the kinds of things that the research tells us are critical for people in order to stay on the job, feel good about the job, do the job well, and remain committed to the mission of the organization. All right. So some principles for leading and supporting. I'm gonna touch on these. These slides will be available. You can come back, you can add to them, but this is kind of a gathering of ideas that my CEO, Kristen Paquette, and I put together just to sort of try to find a way to frame these principles. The first of these is to acknowledge and affirm and create safe and supportive spaces. And so one of those, of course, is to recognize, as we said earlier, the neurobiological effect of collective trauma and its impact. And so we need to take that into account and recognize that it's going to have an impact on how we focus, on our productivity, and just realize that there will be changes in expectations or a redirection or rethinking of what productivity looks like, right? And whether or not people ask for direct support or subtly ask for it, we need to assume that all staff need support. And so how we play that out It might be in increasing frequency of contact or increasing the depth of our contact, or maybe decreasing it, but still having regular contact. But assuming that support and asking people, what does support look like, sound like, feel like to you? What would be most helpful to you at this time? And then continuing to connect. And again, connection, that keeps coming up, doesn't it? And many of you have heard the saying that the opposite of addiction, for example, is connection. And I think that that's the opposite of mental health challenges, is also connection. And so that connection piece is so critically important, right? And then making sure that people are making use of available employee assistance programs and resources, and or just seeking counseling to talk out loud about what's going on. And then for us to set the tone, for us to be a model of openness and compassion, of generosity. And again, I hope that doesn't feel like a burden. I hope it feels like an opportunity. But we know that when we model behavior as leaders and we live it out, and there's not a disconnect or a dissonance between what we want people to be like and or to act with clients and how we treat them, then we know that when there's a synchronicity there, that's all for the better. A few more things. Try to help people get away from work when it's their time off, and really strongly encourage that. And then communication, of course, and communication needs to happen in lots of different ways. Email's not the only way. Texts aren't the only way. Phone calls aren't the only way. And then be careful to not only acknowledge and lift up staff who are the high achievers, if you will, who are going above and beyond. Yeah, that's great. That's great. But in many ways, many of us are achieving as highly as we can just to get by and keeping our heads up. And I think we need to affirm that level of activity as well, so that we're not sending that not so subtle message that you're not pulling your weight or you're not doing enough. Challenging, but I think important. Sadly, I think we're not going to have lots of time for dialogue, but we'll use this as a placeholder, and we could ask ourselves lots of questions, which you might want to do with colleagues. And so I will move on for the moment. But we need to also, I think, and someone mentioned Brene Brown, and she talks a lot about the power of vulnerability and the courage that comes with being vulnerable. And this is not a weakness, it's a huge strength. And it's a way of really showing our own compassion and authenticity, acknowledging the hard parts of our jobs, and acknowledging that we don't know everything as leaders, and we're not always in totally know what direction to go, but being transparent about that. And I'm not here suggesting that we are trying to fall apart and pretend like or act like we're bereft of anything. We still want to provide leadership, but we have to acknowledge that we're not the be all and end all. We don't know everything, and we're all in kind of uncharted territory. Part of this is also just acknowledging that we're all in this together. We're all peers, and yet I think it's also so critically important for many of us, certainly myself included as a white male, that I live with incredible amounts of privilege related to living in these days and times. And many of us do, not all of us, certainly many of us in varying degrees, but I think this too we need to recognize, and we can be grateful for that privilege, but we also recognize that that privilege is on the backs of other people often. And so that learning about our own, shall we say, white supremacy, and our own sense of how we've all been disproportionately privileged as because of the systems that we've set up deliberately. So that's part of this too. Flexibility and gentleness is another part of this. Alternate work schedules and encouraging remote, which I'm sure is happening quite a bit. Flexible sick leave policies and practices. Recognizing that sick leave might be just calling in sick for overwhelm. right? Or calling in sick because I can't focus today, or calling in sick because there's no place in my home where I can find a place there's not a dog barking or a kid romping or all of those. And I know you understand that I'm saying this with some sort of conditions around that, but I think we have to recognize that it's harder to function these days for many of us. And we need to recognize that is a time to take leave, if you will. Certainly providing for people what they need and want at home in order to do their work. Sometimes we have to evaluate what's most important and reset expectations. I do think those of you who provide supervision, that creating extra space and providing more frequency of contact, even if shorter, depending on the person, can be very, very helpful nonetheless. Nobody should be in a situation where they're going it alone for long periods of times, it seems to me, because we all get a little off the track, even delusional, when we're left to our own devices. And so we need to be kept on board, right? Certainly using resources, as I said earlier. And then the last of these is holding the long view, recognizing that everything continues to change. We have now new variants of COVID, and we don't know what the future is, and we don't know when school's going to open. It keeps changing, and we don't know, what shifts in the wind are going to bring us. But we need to keep the long view that we will get through, and this too shall pass. As one of my friends says, this too shall pass, maybe like a kidney stone, but it will pass, right? Sometimes it feels like that. I'm seeing Alicia's comment here. Our performance evals only go up to consistently good. I like that. Yeah, that's a threshold that's well worth reaching. And so I think that one of the things that I'm sure many of you have entertained is that it's probably not helpful to think about ever going back to normal. I'm not even sure normal was ever all that good, frankly. A favorite singer-songwriter of mine, Bruce Cockburn, says the trouble with normal is it always gets worse. But I think what we can do is begin to entertain what a new normal will look like, and hopefully that will be one in which we do, in fact, take a look at our policies, our procedures, and turn things upside down if we have to, or tweak them if we have to, so that we come out of this in a thoughtful way that creates an even richer experience, both for workers, but also for the clients and patients who we serve. All right. I think I might have about 6 minutes to go. I had one more section here that I just wanted to be a little more practical and think with you about things that we might do to promote healthy teams. And these are just suggestions. They're things that I've collected and some of you have contributed to probably. But just thoughts here. And again, I encourage you, if you're interested, take these slides and sort of go through these again and come together as leaders to kind of think about, is there something here that might be useful? Certainly the expectation of secondary trauma, I think, is critical. To have the experience of secondary vicarious trauma is not a weakness, it's actually an expectation, and it should happen if you're doing your job. But we can also mitigate against the extreme kind of effects of that, right? Addressing self-care and team care in team meetings, and not just talking about it, but actually doing things together, whether it's a short exercise, or it's a potluck, a virtual potluck, or whatever that is, right? But come up with something that hopefully that keeps supporting the team and addressing the need for nurturance and care. Certainly making sure people use vacation and comp days in a timely way. Hold a retreat virtually. I really don't know how that would work, but it seems to me anything's possible to do virtually that you can do in person, almost. Flexible work schedules for sure. I'm sure many of you are doing that already. Find some rituals and practices to celebrate what's going well, what people are having. And in this case, the successes and accomplishments, not just the process, but also what are the outcomes that we're thrilled about? Maybe somebody was able to finally get into housing after a long wait, or somebody responded well to the antipsychotic medication they were given and their mind has cleared considerably. All of these things, small and large, are well worth calling out and paying attention to. Doing yoga, desktop yoga as a group, just a thought. But we might also look at ensuring that teams are having ample opportunities to provide their own input, ask questions, but also provide their own wisdom and insights so that we are all working together as a team, and ensure that channels are open for addressing problems and grievances and that they're addressed. That we do diversify caseloads if somebody's struggling with the intensity of a particular caseload. Maybe they're working with a few too many people who are just requiring a great deal of additional energy and energy. And providing opportunities then for participating in social change. I don't know how this works in your place, but I do think that all of us recognize that there are huge systemic flaws in issues in our systems of care that we do and want to address. And I'm distinguishing here from lobbying. That's kind of a different thing, and your funders might not allow you to do that. But we can all have an opportunity to attend community meetings or write a letter or to speak out at a rally or whatever it is, for the good of the clients we serve, as well as for the good of our own organizations. And I hope that that's strongly encouraged. Staff recognition, go home early day, dress up in a particular way day. I mean, really, it's just your own creativity that stands in the way of coming up with things that will support teams. And some team members will think something we do is really cheesy and just not, it's ridiculous. And others will be thrilled. It's just the nature of life in our organizations, right? Sometimes a buddy system, not a supervisory system, but or in addition to supervisors, a buddy system. And that kind of gets back to that best friend at work kind of thing. Maybe that's an important thing to institute. And make sure that our supervision is trauma informed. It's so critical. And also that our supervision incorporates the skills and the heart set and the mindset of motivational interviewing. All of these best practices are intertwined, but especially ensuring that supervision is happening in a one-to-one basis, even if it's also happening in larger team situations. There is no substitute, in my belief, that for the one-to-one meeting, because that's where the safest space can be held and where somebody can speak about things that are critically important to them. All right. So if I may, I'm going to just do a very brief exercise with you, and then I'll pass it back. But I know I've talked a lot, but I also appreciate your contributions. And I will ask if there's one thing that you might think of. You don't have to put it in the chat box, but you may. But one thing you're thinking of that you might do differently as a result of just sort of what you've been taking in today or thinking about. And I'm just going to ask you a few key questions. So something that you might do differently that's actually pretty specific and concrete. So whether or not you choose to do this is up to you. But I'm wondering if you could imagine one thing that you're kind of curious about that you might consider implementing. And I'll just ask you a few questions. If you were to do this, take action or step forward in pursuing whatever this is, what would be some benefits of doing that? How might you benefit, the organization, your staff? Another question you might ask is, what might be at stake if I don't do anything? if we just keep things at the status quo, if I don't institute team meetings and have conversations about self-care, if we don't take a look at diversifying caseloads, what would be at stake if we don't communicate more regularly? How might you go about it in order to implement whatever this might be? What are some ideas you have that might work in order to be successful? And what might be 3 best reasons to do it? Who could support you? Who could have your back? Who could you team up with to move this initiative forward? And what do you think you might do as a very next step or two to kind of do this? Again, I'm not asking you to answer these questions for me or for anybody else, but those of you who are savvy about motivational interviewing recognize that these sort of get at different aspects of motivation, and they're worthy questions to ask ourselves about any action that we're thinking of taking or not taking, and ask ourselves the benefits, what might be at stake, how might we go about it, best reasons, how confident are you, how important is this, who could support, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to leave it there and pass this back to the MHTTC staff.
Great. Thank you so much, Ken. That was a really fantastic presentation. And we had one quick question that we wanted to, I think we all appreciated the activities. And there was one question about talking more about the goal of the river activity. And maybe you can say a bit more about that. I want to remind everyone that our evaluation link is in the chat. And please do that before you leave, and that Ken's next webinar is March 10th, but maybe you can just close with saying a little bit more about the river activity.
Yeah, I think it's gone through a lot of permutations in my own mind. So the purpose of it probably has many answers. I call it a river of resilience because I believe that if we are self-examining and take a close look at what's important to us, our values, who's important to us, the strengths that we bring forth, that we get a better understanding of who we are in this context of work and the world we live in. And that in and of itself is a source of resilience because it helps us tap into those things when at times we feel kind of ill at ease or kind of disoriented. So I think the purpose in part can be in the eyes of the beholder, but for me, it's self-awareness that then lends towards greater healthy relationships and ways of interacting with others.
Great. Well, thanks for walking us through that and for being here today. I want to thank you again and thank everyone for taking the time to learn more about this topic. And as we look forward to seeing you all again on March 10th. Please don't forget to complete the evaluation for today and come visit us on our website and also reach out to us through social media. Thanks everyone for joining.